the interpreter. Thank you.
Good evening, Berkeley community. I'm your mayor, Jesse Adeguin, and I would like to welcome you to this virtual town hall meeting on the City of Berkeley's fiscal year 2022 budget. This is the first town hall meeting we've done in my nearly 5 years as mayor, and it comes at a very critical time in our city as we are coming out of a global pandemic and also as we face many critical challenges from our long-term fiscal health, the need to improve our infrastructure, and as well to address the issues of social justice and racial justice and issues of housing and homelessness. And so we look forward to not only updating you on the city's budget process and also on the budget priorities, but also to answer your questions directly. I want to recognize and thank our panelists for joining us for tonight's discussion. Berkeley City Manager Dee Williams-Ridley, Deputy City Manager David White, and Interim Budget Manager Rama Murthy. After introductory comments, our city team will provide a high-level presentation on the budget process and the proposed fiscal year 2022 Berkeley budget. The goal of tonight's town hall is to inform our Berkeley community about our budget process and to provide greater transparency about our budget, its development, including opportunities for public input, and to answer your questions directly. And it's often said that a budget is a reflection of our values, and that the budget is the most important policy decision made by a city. And under Berkeley City Charter, the city manager, who is the city's chief administrative officer, who is appointed by the city council, presents an annual budget in May to the city council. And the council must adopt a budget before the end of June and an annual appropriations ordinance. And each year, our fiscal year, new fiscal year, starts on July 1st of that year. Normally, we adopt a 2-year budget, but this year, given the uncertainty around the economic impacts of COVID-19, as well as new federal resources available through the American Rescue Plan, the city decided to adopt a 2-year budget and to enable us to evaluate the city's economic health as we make decisions on a budget for next fiscal year. It's worth noting that our system of government in Berkeley is a city council, city manager form of government, in that the council is the legislative branch, elected directly by the people of Berkeley. And the city manager is the city's chief executive, who is hired by the city council to conduct the daily affairs of the city. Over the next few weeks, the council will engage with our city manager, with city staff, and the Berkeley community in reviewing and crafting the city budget. We look forward to answering your questions and working with our community to make sure that our budget truly reflects our community's values and priorities and promotes the long-term fiscal health of our community, especially as we transition out of this global pandemic. So thank you very much for joining us today. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to our city manager, Dee Williams-Ridley, and Deputy City Manager David White, and Budget Manager Rama Murthy, who will provide an overview of the budget process, as well as the proposed fiscal year 2022 budget. Then afterwards, I will provide a brief presentation on my budget priorities, and particularly around the process of reimagining public safety, which has been an issue of great interest in the Berkeley community this past year. And then open up for your questions. So I will now turn it over to our city manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to our Berkeley community for joining us here this evening. I want to just step out very early and thank the panelists on the call with me this evening. Our Deputy City Manager, David White, has been supporting and spearheading our budget process along with Rama Murthy, our budget manager. And I just want to thank both of them for their leadership. This has been a very tight time and a budget process for which we have had to load into a number of weeks, which usually we have months. So I just want to thank them for their work and their leadership. And so we're going to go ahead and launch our presentation, the PowerPoint, so we can get started and move through the PowerPoint. We're going to share in our presentation this evening, both Deputy City Manager and Dave White, Deputy City Manager and our Budget Manager will be sharing with me in this Town Hall budget update. So next slide. So what do we have planned for you today? So we plan to give you a budget overview and development of our budget. We'll be providing a summary of our fiscal 2022 proposed budget that will break down all of our funds and how we've set up our budget, both for the general fund as well as enterprise funds. We'll also talk about our capital improvement program, define what that is, what it looks like, and also talk a little bit about our community agency funding. This is one of the most critical funding procedures and processes that we go through, is funding our community agencies that directly serve our community. We'll also go into some details about our opportunities and challenges that we face as a city. We're not unlike other cities across the United States or the state for that fact. We are all very challenged, and we have found a way to navigate these challenges effectively with the leadership of this council and also with the support of our staff. So I'm going to be going pretty quickly through the PowerPoint slides. I will spend a lot of time talking about the process because I do believe that it's important for our community to know exactly what their involvement and where they can get involved in the budget process and hear the most information and be in tune to how decisions are made. So let's move to the next slide, Rama, and I'll just kick it off. So for the budget overview, I just want to talk a little bit here briefly about the budget is more than just what I would call an accounting of expenditures and revenues, right? There's a great Webster dictionary there, example there for you. What a budget is, it's an estimate of income and expenditures for a set period of time, but it's more than that. It is the way in which we show our community how we link our priorities to funding. And that is critical and important with the budget, because if your budget doesn't reflect your priorities, your budget is not set well. So what we've done here in the city is we've tried to align everything from our budget, which you'll hear more about for fiscal year 22 later in the presentation. You'll hear about our performance measures, which I'll speak to here shortly, and how those things cascade up to a total strategic plan for our city. That tells you the body of work, the goals that we've established as a city through this council and the mayor to prioritize the work that we do. So the purpose clearly is to reflect those priorities of this council and to serve as a plan for us as a city to move forward. We've got to know where we're spending things and if we're serving our Berkeley community well. So that is all tied to the money. And I think people actually want to know, well, are you truly meeting us where we want to be as a community? And we certainly are doing, we certainly are trying to do that. So we also establish funding levels. What are the levels in which we fund particular programs and projects? And then there are a number of changes throughout the fiscal year that we're able to adjust our budget and look at processes and procedures and new revenue and new structures and new resources that we need to allocate. Our budget is also governed by a number of federal, state, and local laws that require us to not only audit, but also to publish annual reporting and to ensure that we actually have a balanced budget and it's adopted each year. Our budget is set from, I believe it's June 30th. So we adopt our budget on June 30th and it goes for that full year. This year in the city's processes, though, we are adopting a one-year budget. We normally adopt a 2-year fiscal budget, but we wanted to be very focused and strategic about where we were as a city post pandemic and well, coming out of pandemic. I think we're still in pandemic, but it's post pandemic. And so we could take our time to really look at what are our resources, what are the state opportunities, state resources that are available to us as a city, and what are our revenues looking like across the city and all of our revenue funds. So the budget basically is more than just accounting and expenditures. It is a real and very serious document that helps us to plan for our city's future. Next slide, please. So how big is our city budget? And I don't know if a number of you know, but we have a pretty large budget here in our city. Our total proposed budget exceeds $593 million. That is what we're proposing for fiscal year 2022. It includes general fund operations, which tally up to about 219.4 million, and enterprise fund operations, which is around $107.5 million. And then there's a 76.8 million for capital improvements across the city. The city of Berkeley manages and monitors over 200 funds within its budget. That is a Herculean effort to manage and monitor those funds, but we do it with ease and pride. Let's move to the next slide, please, Rama. So what does our annual city budget development process look like? And I think it's important here to spend just a little bit of time, because what it looks like on this circular slide is that there are 8 possible opportunities for you as a community to participate and hear about the budget. That is absolutely incorrect. You actually have multiple, to the tune of over 25 to 30 opportunities to participate in the budget process. So let's start first to the right of the slide here, November to December. This is where the city closes out our prior fiscal year. We bring to council what we call an administrative ordinance. And this is the first time we bring that ordinance to council to talk about where we landed as a city. Where did our revenues come in? That's our final accounting of where our revenues came in as a city. What other revenues that we received in the city coffers. And that could be, for example, the American Rescue Plan dollars. Those dollars are in our coffers to date, but we'll be addressing some of the funding needs through that AAO1 process, which happens in November. But this is what we call our closeout. This is where we determine where our staffing levels were. So for example, how many vacancies did we have as a city? Were there vacancy savings? What other projects or programs did we defer because we could not implement them, or that we wanted to push them out for a later time to maybe leverage grant funding? This is an opportunity where the public can actually participate. But what I want to say is, if you back up from that November to December date, there will be a couple of other opportunities. Number one, our Budget and Policy Finance Committee meets on a regular basis, and they will probably meet at least 3 times prior to an AAO1 being implemented. You can participate at that opportunity as well. That is a critical opportunity because the Budget and Finance Policy Committee, which is chaired by our mayor, produces information, asks the difficult questions, provides data, analyzes it with the staff, and provides recommendation to the full council. So as we progress through the end of the year, we move into February, March, our staff is doing a lot of time in between November, December, and February, March to pull together a budget, to start looking at exactly what departmental resources and requests will be. We come to the council sometime in mid-February or March with a mid-year report. This is where we go into detail about our unfunded liabilities, and we talk very specifically about where does the city need to place itself in addressing those unfunded liabilities. What are we looking like mid-year into our budget cycle, and where do we need to make adjustments? Here is another opportunity for you to participate. As we move through February and March into April, there will be a couple of Budget and Policy Finance Committee meetings again at this point, where the community has an opportunity to delve into the budget and talk more. What we're doing behind the scenes is looking at our revenues, figuring out where we are in the first quarter, providing an update to the council on what those look like. Then departments come to our council in April and May to talk about their presentations. This is where we have our baseline budgets presented, we develop them. Departments talk about their priorities, their challenges, accomplishments, and they highlight their performance around the particular areas of their departments and their budgets. This is a critical and very important bulk of presentations that we present to the Budget Policy Finance Committee. Those hearings are held between April and May. So I want to support and request that our community join in to hear those briefings and also to participate at that time. I want to thank our department heads in getting us to our current fiscal year 2022 budget for this year. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes, and we continue to push that effort. As we roll around to May in that annual cycle, the proposed budget is submitted to the City Council. And this is where I've taken a first look and a first glance at where we are as a city and what recommendations that are important to move forward. Key things that I've heard around priorities from our council, things that our community has asked for, things that our department heads are in need of. And they go from every gamut of staffing, to infrastructure needs, to critical personnel needs, to consultant needs. So it could be a number of things that we're looking at across the board in terms of the recommended budget that I put forward to the council. At the end of the day, my role is to recommend a budget to the council, and the council is the decision-making power for our budget. In June, our council holds a number of public hearings. This is again where our community can participate, and the budget is adopted no later than June 30th of each year. Next slide. As the new fiscal year begins in July, all of the funds that you see here shows how the budget is organized. And the team is going to go into some details about our budget and how things are set up. But I want to just share in a one-on-one type of a presentation, what are the funds that make up this budget? As I shared with you, we have over 200. These are the major fund types that we have. The general fund, that is the biggest fund that I believe most folks are most attuned to, because most of the services are provided out of this fund. It is the broadest in nature. It provides the greatest level of flexibility and discretionary funding, and it pays for a wide variety of community services: police, fire, parks, general services through the city. So let's jump to enterprise funds. Enterprise funds, they feel and look like basic business, right? They look like a business. So this is where a fund is self-sustaining, is directly and restricted to the users of a fund. For example, it's supported by ratepayers, and it's based on charges for the full charge for a service. Not always do we charge the full charge for a service, but the City Council determines what charges we place or fees that we place around these funds. So the enterprise fund, again, is a fund that looks more like a business. An example would be garbage and sewer. Debt service funds, I think that speaks for itself. These are restricted to payment of debt service. This is when we purchase a building or we build a parking garage. They all have debt service funds. They may be a different type of payment source, but they are all debt. And so we have to pay those debts, and there's specific debt service funds to make those payments. Special revenue funds, and these are tied to very specific revenue streams, and trust funds, and those are restricted to a specific purpose as well. You can only use them for the intended purpose. An example here would be our 115 trust for our unfunded liabilities around OPEB. And then reserves, and this is for use in emergencies, and it's restricted for specific uses. I want to take a moment here to applaud our mayor and council, because this council was the first to set up a policy around our reserves, mandating that funding be placed into these reserves to not only build for a rainy day, but to address catastrophic disaster in our city. And we are doing well. While we had to tap into those funds last year, we are still in line of contributing to replenish those reserves moving forward. And the staff will go into those details later as well. Next slide, please. I only was to take up 10 minutes, so I'm gonna keep 5 minutes, so I'm moving a little slow here. So the last slide for me is on citywide performance measures. And Mr. Mayor, I wanna thank you for recognizing that this has been my long loved vision for the city in putting forward performance measures for the organization. It measures how much we do, how well we do it, is anyone better off for what we're doing. There are over 70 plus measures across the city that we've developed and will nurture. Those measures are important because what they do is they help to determine whether or not our levels of services meet the needs of our community, if we're doing what we say we will do, and if we're doing it within budget, on time, and it's affecting someone's life in a very positive way. Next slide. The next slide just kind of highlights some of the performance measures. One of the critical things here, these are some examples of our performance measures in our budget book. And what's important about our measures is that they cascade down from our strategic goals, and then they align with our budget. So what things are we doing to support the performance of the city? And do they actually do they tie significantly to the city's goals and outcomes? So I would say yes. We're looking at pavement conditions across the city. We're looking at arts and culture grants and how much our city is contributing to that. And then the next is the percent of commute trips by solo occupant vehicles. That's important. We are climate strong and we are working towards addressing climate issues in our city. Meals provided by aging services divisions. That's critical. It helps people and it supports our senior community. And then an average city plan check for review. We want to always be reducing the time that it takes to get someone served for a permit in our city to do business or to build. And so, as you can see, this is just an example of some of the wonderful performance measures that we've lifted up to measure what we do, how we do it, how well we do it, and is anyone better off? So thank you for the opportunity to provide this very quick and fast-paced budget overview. And now I will turn it over to David White to give an all funds budget overview. Thank you, Mr.
Mr. White starts. I just want to acknowledge that we've talked for many years about having performance metrics included in our city budget, and to really show how we're spending our taxpayer dollars to achieve outcomes. And this is the first budget. And this is actually a question that we got. Why don't we audit the budget? We do, for the first time, have performance metrics baked into the city budget. And we encourage every resident to go to the City of Berkeley's website, cityofberkeley.info, to download the city budget. It's budget books. I think it's hundreds of pages. But the performance metrics are a really interesting aspect of the budget proposal to track how we are not only providing city services, but how we are implementing our strategic plan, which is a high-level document that sets goals and priorities for the city organization. So I want to thank the city manager for her persistence and commitment to incorporating performance metrics and really presenting outcomes around how we're delivering services so that we can also report back to the City of Berkeley and also hold ourselves accountable for further improving service delivery. So I will turn over to Mr. White.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and thank you, Madam City Manager. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate on this town hall and talk about the budget. So the next part of this journey will go into some of the numbers. I'm going to do just a quick high-level overview from a very 50,000-foot perspective on our total budget. And then our budget manager, Rama Murthy, is going to dig into the general fund and some of our other funds. So the most important slide that I think I wanted to touch on is this one here. And as the mayor mentioned, our budget book is available. It's hundreds of pages long. And when you go through it, you begin to piece together all the various exciting initiatives that are funded in our budget. Of course, we're addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. We've got some very, very major land use planning and policy projects underway, exciting infrastructure projects. I know the community is so excited that we'll be repaving the Marina Streets, University Avenue, Marina, and Spinnaker. And thank you for everyone supporting Measure T1. We've got resources allocated to protecting our community from wildfire. And of course, we're looking very much so at cyber resiliency. And that's been something that's been very present in the news recently. In terms of our total budget, as the city manager mentioned, it's large. So our total revenues are about $532 million, and our total expenditures are nearly $594 million. And you may ask, what's the gap? So of course, we have reserves that we have built up over time, particularly when we're looking to invest in capital projects. And we have a number of different measures that we've gone out and raised resources for that we are spending down over time. Think about Measure T1 and think about Measure O. In terms of our revenue streams, from an all funds perspective, you can see the majority of our revenues are coming from two sources: our general fund, which is our most discretionary fund, and then a plethora of enterprise funds as well, which Rama will dig into a little bit more. As you can see, we also do derive significant revenue from grants, from our internal service funds, and then our special revenue funds as well. And as we go through this presentation, these terms will become more clear to everyone. In terms of our expenditures, how they break down by department, this table here will give you just a very high-level overview of how our expenses are assigned to various departments. What is worth noting is by far and away our largest department is our Public Works Department. That's attributable to the capital that they have under their belt, as well as the significant operating departments. Think about zero waste, sewer, and the maintenance that we do there, stormwater, etc. And then when you look down that list, you'll see that our second largest department is Health, Housing, and Community Services. Very significant operation, and especially with what they've put on their shoulders around COVID-19, are seeing additional resources come into their department as well. And then the third largest department, as you'll see from this slide here, is our police department. So I will now turn it over to Rama, who will go through the general fund and some other funds, and then we'll conclude with some opportunities and challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. So moving on to our general fund and budget. For fiscal year 2022, our current general fund revenues are at $186.1 million, and this this excludes Measure P and Measure U1 revenues, as well as transfer tax revenues that are over the baseline of $12.5 million. Our projected expenditure budget is currently at $206 million, and this includes about $8.6 million in deferrals for fiscal year 2022. One thing to keep in mind is in balancing our budget for fiscal year 2021, we had to implement almost about $20 million in deferrals to help balance our budget. And so for fiscal year 2022, we've pulled back on that deferral amount to a slightly reduced level of about $8.6 million. So currently our budget deficit is close to about $20 million. Next slide. So when you look at our general fund revenue budget, one thing that becomes very clear from this chart is there are certain categories where we get most of our general fund revenues. The major categories are our property tax revenues, our sales tax and soda tax revenues, our business license revenues, and then our utility users revenues. Next slide. So when you look at at this chart, what we've highlighted are the three revenue sources that that are specifically earmarked for specific purposes. Those include our property transfer tax revenues that are over the $12.5 million, our Measure U1 revenues, which are around $4.6 million, and our property and transfer tax revenues tied to Measure P, which add up to about $7 million. Next slide. So then you ask the question, well, what does the general fund pay for? So almost 50% of our budget goes to public safety, and that includes police and fire. The next largest slice in the pie goes to our general government departments, which are all the support departments, like the city attorney's office, our finance department, the city manager's office, our human resources, city clerk's office, to name some of them. And then the next biggest category is our health, housing, and community services department. Next slide. So when you look at our general fund budget as a whole, One thing that becomes very clear is most of our general fund budget pays for our personnel and staffing costs. So almost 67% of our budget, as you can see in the slide, is made up of personnel costs, and the remaining portion is our non-personnel costs. Next slide. So now we're going to move on to some of our other operating funds. As the city manager was pointing out, our enterprise funds that we have in the city are fees that are paid for and paid for city services, and they're specifically restricted for those purposes. Some examples are on this slide, include our permit service center fund, our zero waste fund, which pays for our solid waste refuse services, our sanitary sewer fund, our parking funds both on street and off street, and our marina fund. Next slide. Special revenue funds are revenues that are specifically tied to specific programs or services. They include tax-based revenues. Some examples are our parks tax, which pays for the maintenance and operation of our parks, our library tax, which pays for the city's libraries, and our camps fund, which pays for the city's campsites. Next slide. We have a number of special assessment funds that pay for specific improvements or services for certain city services. A couple of examples are our Clean Stormwater Fund and our Streetlight Assessment Fund. Next slide. So moving on to our community agency funding. So for FY 2022, our total community agency funding is at around $20.5 million. You'll see from this slide that most of that goes to our homeless services and the rest going to a variety of other programs. Next slide. So then moving on to our capital improvement program. So our capital improvement program is funding that's allocated, and there's a plan for, for infrastructure improvements and equipment purchases. They're used for complex projects that span multiple years. The funding sources that make up these, these projects include general fund, Measure T1, which was approved by voters only a few years ago. Special revenue funds like Measure FF, Measure B, and Measure BB, grant, insurance reimbursements. There are a number of variety of sources that go into these projects. Next slide. So for fiscal year 2022, our total capital budget is close to about $76.8 million. And it's made up of, or some funding pieces to it include about $12 million in Measure T1 funding and almost $11 million in general fund resources. One thing to note is currently our total unfunded capital needs are close to about $1.1 billion. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Deputy City Manager Dave White to look at the immediate and long-term opportunities and challenges that we're going to be facing.
Thank you, Rama. So I just wanted to quickly touch on for everyone some of the things that keep all of us on this side of the Zoom call up at night. So not unlike many communities throughout the state, we've been significantly impacted by COVID-19 from an economic perspective. And some of the areas that I would highlight for the community that are on this call is particularly around the tourist industry, our hotels, our arts community has been particularly hard hit due to the inability to hold performances. And then a number of our enterprise funds, particularly our parking funds, due to the slowdown in economic activity. As our city manager mentioned, our council has shown tremendous leadership in establishing a general fund reserve, and we've had to use that reserve to get us through these hard times. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Pension and healthcare costs, not like any other municipal jurisdiction throughout the state, we are seeing significant rises and are working very hard to address those issues. And we have unfunded liabilities. As Rama had just mentioned, infrastructure is a really big deal. We see and experience every day the condition of our roads and other pieces of infrastructure. And so we take great concern and care and are thinking very long-term about how to address these issues. But thank goodness for the American Rescue Plan. If it weren't for the American Rescue Plan, this discussion would look much, much differently. So let me just take you through a few slides so we can conclude. So here's our general fund reserves. We, back in 2017, the council adopted a very extensive general fund reserve policy. What's notable about it is that it's broken up into two components, a stability reserve and a catastrophic reserve. And in thinking really deeply about the complexity of our city, the number of different challenges that our city faces, from earthquakes to wildfires to pandemics to economic slowdown, the council established some very strong targets for our reserves. So we should be at 16.7% right now. That's typical standard industry policy, and have a goal to get to 30% of our revenues over time. You can see, because we had to pull down our reserves last year, our reserves are lower than what we would like them to be, and we're working very hard to replenish them. Council last December allocated about $3.3 million to our reserves and is pushing us every day that we come in front of them at our committee meetings to think about ways that we can address and replenish our reserves. PERS, pensions, contributions, what does the future look like? So because of a number of changes that CalPERS has adopted over time, we have experienced and are anticipated to experience a significant increase in our pension contributions. This is not necessarily going to be long lasting, but it's a hill that we're going to have to climb. And so you can see from this slide, we are anticipating our pension contributions to increase from about 51.3 million to more than 100 million in a very discrete, defined period of time. And again, this is not unique. This is something that jurisdictions throughout the state are experiencing, and there are a number of strategies and ways that we can address this. So one of the things that we're doing is we've established what's called the Section 115 Trust. And basically what that is in a nutshell is we are setting aside money very much like a savings account, and we are accruing interest on the money that is set aside, and we will be able to access and use that money in the future to offset our pension contributions. We have established a target for what we believe we should be contributing, about $4 to $6 million per year. Some years we've met that target, such as fiscal year 19. In other years, as you see in fiscal year 20, we have not. But we have thought very deeply, and council has directed us to think about ways that we can increase our contributions to this trust. So a couple of things that we're doing that I think are fairly innovative, and I'm really happy to be able to share with everyone on this call, is one, we have refinanced a lot of our debt and plan on using the savings from that debt to fund our 115 Trust. And we also do something called pre-funding, where we pay in advance our pension contribution for the year, and we'll be using some of those savings as well to help build up this trust. And then lastly, I'll just talk about the American Rescue Plan, because I want to end on a positive note. So through this act of federal legislation that was adopted not many months ago, the city of Berkeley will be entitled to receive about $66.6 million. And we are in the process of accessing the first half of that money, with anticipation of receiving the next half about a year from now, a little bit less. And there's a number of different ways that we can use this money, but most importantly, it's about ensuring continuity in government services. It's about supporting our community through the COVID-19 emergency, as well as all the folks that have disproportionately been impacted by this terrible pandemic. Unfortunately for Ram and I, there are a lot of reporting requirements, which we're just getting familiar with, and there are a number of rules and regulations that we are slowly starting to understand, and that will certainly shape how this money is utilized over time and how it can be provided in order to ensure that we can continue to provide excellent programs and services. So with that, that concludes our presentation. And again, I just want to say personally, thank you very much, Mayor, and thank you very much, City Manager, for this opportunity to be available.
Thank you so very much, Madam City Manager and Mr. White and Mr. Murty for the very informative presentation, really not only talking about what is a budget, the budget cycle, because this is just one part of a year-round budget process cities engaged in, and opportunities for the community to participate and the different components of the city budget. And I just want to thank our staff for all their hard work year-round in not just in developing our budget, but managing our city's finances and implementing the various policies and programs that we've adopted. And so with that, I want to just show a few more slides before we transition to answering your questions. So let me share screen. And I think everyone should be able to see that. So I wanted to highlight my priorities for this budget process. And I did share these with members of the Berkeley community through a recent email that I had sent around the city budget. First and foremost, for me, our COVID-19 response and recovery is my highest priority. We are still in a state of emergency, even though we are slowly reopening our economy. And I just want to acknowledge that next week, June 15th, is an important milestone in our COVID response, in that the tiered blueprint will no longer be in effect, and new public health requirements will be in place around masking and physical distancing. And this is a recognition of all the sacrifice and work that our community and our state and our federal government has done to get us through this last year, which I would say has been one of the most challenging years that we have ever experienced as a community, and certainly as a country and as a world. And I just want to thank the Berkeley community for your diligence, for following science, for following our public health measures, for thinking about the health and safety of everyone in our community. And as a result, we are making great progress in controlling the spread of COVID-19. We're squashing the curve, and that enables us to reopen our local economy and to begin to transition out of this pandemic. So we need to continue our efforts to vaccinate our population. I want to acknowledge that we have about roughly 65% of our city has been fully vaccinated, and over 70% has received one dose. And those numbers continue to increase on a daily basis. And thank you to our public health officer and public health department, our partners with Alameda County, as well as with our healthcare providers, working with us to increase our vaccination rates to make sure everyone in our community gets access to vaccines. We also need to continue to contain COVID cases, because until everyone's vaccinated, the risk of infection still remains. And then as we're moving out of this pandemic, we need to address the economic impacts that our community has experienced and will experience for many more months and years to come. We know that the impact of COVID will be felt for many more years. And that includes, expanding rental assistance for tenants who are facing significant rent debt and housing insecurity, expanded funding for our arts organizations, many of whom have been shuttered these past 15 plus months, and expanded small business assistance and support so that we can get our businesses, through this recovery period, and also to encourage people to come back to our commercial districts and to support our businesses. So COVID-19 response and recovery is my highest priority, as well as our fiscal health. As was noted last year, we faced a $40 million budget deficit, one of the largest we've ever faced. And this was due to a significant drop in revenue due to the shelter-in-place restrictions. And so we had to dip into our general fund reserve. And I'll just acknowledge that if we didn't have a general fund reserve, we would not have been able to balance our budget. And we would have had to make some very difficult decisions around either laying off personnel or furloughing personnel or not providing certain city services. And because we made the decision to create a reserve fund and set aside, tens of millions of dollars, that enabled us to be able to balance our budget last year. But we need to replenish that reserve, because we know that while we've gotten through this public health emergency, Berkeley faces many threats, from wildfire threats to being on an active earthquake fault, and we need to be prepared so our city can respond in the event of another emergency and to ensure the long-term fiscal health of our city. And we also need to put more money aside to our Section 115 pension trust, as Mr. White just talked about, to address our long-term unfunded employee benefit liability. Public safety is extremely important. Addressing fire prevention through vegetation management, clearing paths, our safe passages program, and then we're also looking at a new emergency warning system that will be possible through the passage of Measure FF, thanks to the voters of Berkeley. I want to look at expanding bike patrols in high crime areas and expanding hours for a mental health crisis response. And this is something that we'll talk about in response to some of the questions around the increase in crime and the mental health crisis that we're seeing on our streets. We want to look at how we can not just support our efforts around violence prevention, but to continue the work around public safety reimagining, including funding the creation of a specialized care unit, and then looking at how we can improve traffic safety, because public safety is multidimensional. It's not just how we prepare to respond to emergencies, but how are we improving the overall health and safety of our community overall. And that not only includes how we address policing, but also how our streets are designed and how we are keeping our streets safe through traffic calming and Vision Zero projects. Homelessness remains a critical issue, not just in Berkeley, but throughout the region. And we need to continue to support not just providing emergency shelter, but permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. I want to announce, and I'm very excited to acknowledge that next month, we will be opening a new shelter at 742 Grayson Street with the hope of providing safe parking for vehicles on the site. We are looking at how to leverage state resources, including the home key dollars, to provide permanent housing. We need to expand sanitation and public health, support trash pickup around encampments, and fund rental subsidies to get people off the street, because housing is the solution to homelessness. Putting people in shelters or in hotels, that's a short-term intervention. That doesn't end homelessness. That doesn't put people on a path to self-sufficiency and recovery. And so we must continue to prioritize housing as a solution to homelessness. And then lastly, infrastructure. And our capital improvement plan, which is part of our budget, I think is an important opportunity for us to really invest in our infrastructure, fixing our roads and public buildings and facilities, including an amazing opportunity we have at our waterfront. I just want to touch on that. We're in the middle of a process right now through the Berkeley Marina Area Strategic Plan to plan for a new future for the waterfront, which could include a new ferry. And I really just want to acknowledge that, encourage the Berkeley community to participate in that process. And this will position Berkeley well, our investment in infrastructure, to potentially leverage dollars that may become available through the passage of the American Jobs Plan, which we know is likely to happen this fall, which will provide billions of dollars in funding for cities like Berkeley to invest in our infrastructure, to create jobs, and to address our climate and equity issues. And so I want to make sure Berkeley's well positioned to be able to leverage the money that's available through the American Jobs Plan. I want to talk about reimagining public safety, because obviously this is an area of great interest, especially since last year, the tragic murder of George Floyd, and the process the City Council launched through the adoption of the omnibus package. I want to also update you on the reimagining public safety process. So there's clarity around how we are moving forward in our efforts to reimagining Berkeley's approach to public safety. So last year, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the national movement for police reform, the City Council unanimously adopted an omnibus motion, which was a package of many different reforms, including looking at taking police out of traffic enforcement, creating a specialized care unit, and looking at other ways to reform our approach to public safety. In February 2021, the City Council adopted the recommendations of our Fair and Impartial Policing Task Force, which actually was launched a number of years ago, actually a year prior to the murder of George Floyd, with the goal of addressing racial disparities in police stops. We know that police stops are the most common method of police community interaction. And the data has shown disparities based on race and who the police stop on bike, on foot, and by car. And so we wanted to dive into, why do these disparities exist? How can we reduce these disparities and promote a new model in traffic enforcement. And so the council adopted those recommendations. And that's what I kind of frame as phase one of the reimagining public safety work, by beginning to look at a new model of traffic enforcement to reduce pretext stops and to focus on enforcement based on behavior that poses the greatest risk to public safety: speeding, reckless driving, and not focusing or limited police resources on traffic behaviors that don't pose the greatest risk to public safety. So that work is ongoing as well, simultaneously with the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force. The task force launched actually this February, and it's held at least 8 meetings. And a community survey has been published and is open until June 15th, next week. And I highly encourage everyone to fill out this survey around public safety. You can find the survey on the city's homepage at www.cityofberkeley.info. And the city intends to host at least 5 listening sessions with community members, and citywide and district-specific town halls and feedback sessions with the goal of drafting recommendations on a new paradigm for public safety in Berkeley. We know that means many things for people in our community. For some, it means taking police out of certain functions. For some, that means having more police on bikes and walking the beats and building greater relationships between the police and merchants in the community. And so we need to engage everyone from the hills to the flats in this conversation around reimagining public safety. And I want to just commend Mr. White and Nick Jr., the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, and all of our members of our city team who've been leading this process, and the members of the task force. But since we launched the task force in February and the work is ongoing, as evidenced by this timeline, structural changes are not ready yet for the June budget. And so we need to honor the community process that's underway. Making changes of this magnitude, and the council committed to a process of deep community engagement that will result in a bold yet thoughtful restructuring of our city's public safety services. That requires that we have sufficient time for community engagement and for the work of our task force and experts to weigh in, and to have multiple opportunities for the public to participate in this important conversation, to define what are the appropriate types of crisis responses and community investments that are needed for our city to be safe for all. Changing the paradigm of public safety in our city will take time. Still, we know that some alternative responses are necessary and can be implemented in the near future. I want to reaffirm my commitment, and I think this is a commitment that's shared by our city manager, as part of the June budget process to fund the launch of the specialized care unit, which I know is something that many members of the community have advocated for and something we'll address in the questions. And we are making progress towards a new approach to traffic enforcement. Step one, as I noted, is an evidence-based policing approach that is de-emphasizing low-level offenses while we work towards the creation of a new Berkeley Department of Transportation. I think it's important to note that in order to implement a civilian traffic enforcement model, that requires a bill by the state legislature to enable a city like Berkeley to be able to do that. And while conversations are happening, we do not yet have that legislative authorization, but a lot of work is happening to explore the potential for creating a Department of Transportation, the costs, what will be involved, the feasibility, so that we're prepared to have those conversations this fall and moving forward. So I want to acknowledge part of the budget, the baseline budget the city manager submitted, is holding our police department staffing levels at their current level until our community process is complete. And that will enable us to have a robust discussion, to develop new models, and to make decisions on what is the appropriate staffing level in Berkeley and the appropriate way to deploy our police. What are these alternative models, and how can that reduce that 33% of the general fund, which is increasingly going towards policing costs? So to save taxpayer dollars that could be reinvested in alternative models and programs that can reduce the need for law enforcement intervention, and also to prioritize public safety, to prioritize community policing. So, our goal, as noted here, is for the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force and Nick Jr. to make draft recommendations by September of 2021, with the goal of those recommendations coming to the City Council in November, in time for the November annual appropriations ordinance process. As the city manager had noted before, the budget process is a year-round process. And so while we adopt a budget, a 2-year or 1-year budget in June, we often have to make adjustments to the budget mid-year. And usually that occurs in November of the year after the previous year's fiscal year closes and we know what revenues are available. And lately, thanks to a robust economy, we have seen additional revenues, what are called excess equity, available for potential reallocation for immediate priorities and programs. And so and we do likely expect, although we will have to see, excess equity be available. And so the goal is to align the conclusion of the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force process with the November budget process. And it is anticipated that major recommendations may be incorporated into the budget at this time. So we are in the middle of the process now, but there are things that we can explore, such as a specialized care unit, and the work continues. And while some decisions may not be made in June, we are queuing things up for discussions in November at the conclusion of this community process. So I just wanted to provide a high-level overview since that's been an issue of great interest to the community. With that, I just want to encourage members of the Berkeley community to email any follow-up comments, ideas, or questions to me at mayor@cityofberkeley.info. And with that, we have a number of questions that we would like to get to. And so I want to thank once again our panelists for joining us, and we'll turn to your questions. So the first question is, why does the annual appropriations ordinance exist? This resident says, it seems like, quote, pure political pandering. And Madam City Manager or staff, you can talk about the AAO. It's, we have to make adjustments throughout the year to our budget to carry over funds or to fund new emerging needs. And typically what we've done is we have actually funded, programs through additional excess equity. And so could you talk a little bit about the annual appropriations ordinance?
So yes, so thank you, Mr. Mayor, and certainly the team can join in here as well. But not a pandering, but certainly an important part of the process in which we know at the end at that time where additional revenues came in that last quarter. So we're able to report out where any revenue changes occurred and reset on any things that we held off on budgeting for because we were waiting to determine if we have any savings. I think the AAO process also provides the council another opportunity to pretty much check where they are with their referrals and priorities. Are we in par with what our priorities are? Are there priorities that we need to reconsider and fund again? I think the AAO provides the staff with the opportunity to also have some of the operational needs addressed later in the process as well, so that we can implement services and programs for our community. It is another way of being transparent. Because think about it, if we didn't have the AAO process, we would close out, you would see the information in the annual CAFR, and that's where you would realize it. But we close out, we share the information, how we ended the year, and we have a process around year end. And that's what you're receiving as a community, is greater transparency around our dollars and how our revenues have landed or ended. Rama, do you want to add to that? Or Dave?
Yeah, I think also the AAO process allows us to adjust the amounts that are budgeted in all the various city funds, not only internally for departments. It allows us to carry over capital project funding that's still ongoing and hasn't been completely spent. So it's a much more involved process, not only in terms of the funds that are remaining at the end of the year that can be used for for community and council priorities, but also internally for a number of various funds like our capital improvement funds, as well as grant funds that haven't been spent. And we need to have a vehicle in which to reappropriate those funds over into the next fiscal year.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. So moving on to the next question, which is around our our ambulance budget. So this question asks, the fire department forecast spending 2.4 million on transfers via ambulance for psychiatric care. What percentage of these are true medical emergencies? Those that aren't medical emergencies could be covered through an SCU or interim SCU. This would result in significant savings as we're being billed 2 million annually by Falk for ambulance transports when some of those transports don't require paramedic, EMT, or ambulance response. I think this gets to our 5150 transports, our emergency mental health transports, where I think it was in 2019, the county cut our funding when the funding of some other local communities that have their own EMS service. And so the city was required to pick up those costs, which I think average around up to 4 million a year. And so we did fund that and launched as an interim step while we were evaluating how to address the issue of mental health transports, contracting with an out-of-city provider. And so, yes, I just want to acknowledge, yes, we are looking at creating an SCU, and that could help in terms of reducing the need for some of those emergency transports. We have not yet launched an SCU, but Madam City Manager, I want to give you the opportunity if there's anything you'd like to add on that.
No, Mayor, you did a great job. Certainly, if our Deputy City Manager wants to jump in, but I think one of the things here to share with our community is that through our Budget and Finance Policy Committee, we're certainly scrutinizing how Falk is recouping the costs for these transports. We're looking at their processes. We're actually looking at how they can, provide the city relief if there's a possibility for that. But we are in a spot right now where we have to kind of manage through where we are to get to our next place. So we're in a holding spot right now. And I just want to encourage folks to be patient as we navigate through this. Dave, is there anything additional you'd like to add around the information that our fire department truly shared at our Budget and Finance Policy Committee here recently? I think that was helpful as well.
I'll just amplify. I really like the question about how a specialized care unit might impact this service, because I think it's something that we are eagerly working on right now in terms of designing what is the type of mental health and behavioral health services that will be available to folks in our community. And it will be very interesting to see over time, as we are more and more proactive in responding to these types of calls, to what extent might we be able to mitigate or decrease the number of 5150 responses. So I think that's something that you will see us measure over time as we expand our services for the community.
Yeah, and as noted, we're in a kind of a transition moment here where we were required to have to fully cover the costs of this critical service, but we acknowledge that this is not the right intervention. That there are things that we can do through a whole person care model to reduce the need to have to transport people for treatment, to provide care and services. And to address the sort of social determinants that lead to sort of these high acuity calls occurring. So that's the whole idea around the specialized care unit. And I think all the more reason why it's really important that we continue the work that has started to explore and create a specialized care unit. So I wanted to address the next question to our city manager, which is, why don't we have performance metrics to determine if how the city funds are being allocated? And as we had talked about early on, we have launched performance metrics as part of this budget process, but I want to give the city manager an opportunity to talk about that, as well as the strategic plan and the work we're doing around tracking the implementation of the strategic plan.
So thank you, Mr. Mayor. And yes, we've arrived at our first set of performance measures for the city. This is a first in the city's history, and I'm really extremely proud of that. I think that it's been a long journey. We have a long way to go because we want to get as edgy with our performance measures as possible, creating dashboards so that the community can engage in those dashboards. And that will take time for us to lift those things up, but we are in it, and we're committed to it. And I think what we've shaped so far are performance measures that directly cascade to our strategic plan goals. They are directly aligned to all of the goals. And that is what I was most hopeful for, is that we could look at a specific goal, like just take fiscal accountability. Where are we aligning for fiscal accountability? Where are we aligning for retaining a diverse workforce? Where are we aligning around climate, around equity? And so there are just so many amazing programs, projects, policies that we're implementing at the leadership of this council that support our strategic plan goals, that show a performance outcome, that are tied to a budget. And it is absolutely a major sea change for our city. So very proud of the performance measures for our staff and for our organization. And hopefully that answers the question, Mr. Mayor. We've done it, and we're going to continue to improve and build upon it. So I'm happy to report that out.
I thank you. This is something we are going to hopefully build upon in the future years. I just also want to acknowledge that every year there is an audit of our financial reports. That is a public document that's required by law, not only our city finances, but also an audit of the grants that we receive from the federal government. Those are public documents. And then, as we know, the city auditor, whose job under the city charter is to conduct performance audits, does regular auditing of various different programs and expenditures. And that's an important function that she plays to help provide greater transparency around city operations and ways to improve the work that we do to serve the Berkeley community. So thank you. Another question was asked why the proposed city budget did not include any funding for the BERC initiative. And I did touch upon this in some of my earlier comments, that we are in the middle of a public process around reimagining public safety. But that doesn't mean that our city staff is not working to explore the creation of BERC. And I want to just give Mr. Weider, the city manager, an opportunity to just say a few words about that.
Go ahead, Dave, I'll defer to you.
Great, thank you. So we are working very hard, and I want to appreciate the mayor for giving a plug for the community survey that is available on our website to help us receive deep input around the future of public safety in the city of Berkeley. As it pertains to BERC, we have a number of initiatives that are in the works. BERC is one of them. Our fire department is looking at a priority dispatching system. Our Health, Housing, Community Services Department, has been mentioned numerous times, is engaged thoughtfully around the development of a specialized care unit for the community. And both myself and Shamika Cole are working very closely with the 17-member Reimagining Task Force on shaping the future of our police department. As it pertains to BERC, that initiative is being led by our Public Works Director, Liam Garland, and he has been working with the Public Works Commission, the Transportation Commission, and is thinking very deeply about different ways and alternatives to really meet council in terms of the referral that they provided. And so our hope is that over time, we'll be able to provide some well thought out recommendations for the council about things ranging from traffic enforcement to parking enforcement to school crossing guards to collision and traffic violence analysis, really trying to help provide a number of different recommendations and thoughts about how we can approach the direction and recommendations that we receive from council. So that work is in process. We're doing community engagement. We have presented some different recommendations to various commissions to date, and our hope is to bring forward a more well thought out recommendation as we move forward in the process to City Council. Thank you.
Thank you. So once again, this is one of those issues that we hope to revisit. We will be revisiting in November. After the Public Safety Reimagining Task Force, completes its recommendations. Our staff is working on developing recommendations. As noted, this does require a bill, a state bill, to enable civilian traffic enforcement. There may be things that we can do now, like school crossing guards or certain functions under a civilian department. In addition, it's long been an interest of mine, I think some members of our city council, to have a a Department of Transportation that's really focused on our Vision Zero policies and really coordinating, not only within this department, but across the city organization, and how we can not only implement projects and infrastructure, but how we do enforcement that's really focused on pedestrian, bicyclists, and motorist safety. So there may be many opportunities for us to move this conversation forward. And this is, once again, one of those areas where we will be certainly continuing the conversation in the fall. So the next question is around bonds. This resident has asked, why do we need special bonds and taxes to pay for predictable basic infrastructure maintenance? Shouldn't these be paid out of the general fund? And I just want to acknowledge that there is money from the general fund that does go towards capital projects. We have a capital improvement fund, and part of our budget adoption is the adoption, not just the budget, but also a capital improvement plan that outlines street repaving, sidewalk repair, improvements to facilities, and other capital projects throughout the year. I guess I would defer to staff on how much we provide in terms of funding through our general fund for capital projects. I know that we've increasingly been increasing the funding for street repaving, not just through the general fund, but also through the gas tax, SB1, and other state and regional funding sources. Certainly our infrastructure needs are great, and this is the result of many years of deferred maintenance. And so we need to certainly accelerate the work we're doing around improving our infrastructure. And while we are making investments now, we know that we need to make many more investments in the future. This is something that our staff and the city council is very actively engaged in. In fact, we just voted, I think, a few weeks ago to begin to look at not just sort of our long-term capital needs, but what are financing mechanisms or opportunities to be able to address the $300 million in deferred street repaving needs and other capital projects, which are in the hundreds of millions. That may be a bond, that may be other financing mechanisms. And this is also following up on the adoption of the Vision Zero plan and the Vision 2050 plan. One that's focused on traffic safety, and the other is focused on our long-term infrastructure needs. But Mr. Murty or David, I don't know if you have any insights around how much general fund do we contribute. I know that the excess property transfer tax, we contribute over $12.5 million to our capital improvement plan.
So annually, we contribute close to about $5 million, and that goes towards not just, it goes towards streets, it goes towards sidewalks, it goes to ADA work. So it covers like a wide variety of capital programs, but that's just a small drop in the bucket towards the overall need. So so in funding all of our capital needs, there is a need for more funding sources and to cover the program costs. So that's kind of why we need funding from bonds and other funding sources like grants and revenue sources from the state, as well as gas tax funds. All of that combined helps fund our overall capital needs as a whole.
Yeah, and I'll just say that there was another question around why don't you fund street repair in the city budget to the amount required? We don't need a bond issue, make some hard choices. Well, as noted on that pie chart that was provided, a significant portion, I think it's probably over 70% of our general fund is actual personnel costs, and 33% is police and 17% is fire. And so we could potentially just focus general fund revenues on that, but that would come at the expense of delivering other really critical public services, including public safety. So we do have to make hard choices, but we also have to, our job is to provide an array of critical social services and public safety services for our community. And our budget is the vehicle in which we're able to fund those things. So, I'll just say that, with respect to bonds versus general fund, we need a significant investment in infusion of funds, which I think is really critical for us to be able to leverage not only money through the American Rescue Plan, but also potentially funds available through the American Jobs Plan that's being considered by Congress. And so, this is something that we're actively exploring and we'll be discussing in the coming months. So thank you very much. So moving on, there was a question around council members' discretionary office budgets. And part of the budget for mayor and city council is funding for staff, and we fund one staff person for council offices. And the mayor's office, I have 4 staff people as I represent the whole city, and money for non-personnel expenditures, which are usually office expenses, equipment, and other expenses necessary for the office holder to conduct their work. And so oftentimes, members of the council will have extra funds available in their budgets, which they may decide to contribute towards nonprofit organizations and community events. And so those decisions are made by the entire city council through a public process. And recently, I just want to note, we did adopt a policy that donations put forward by a council member are made on behalf of the entire city, not by an individual council member. So, if there are additional resources that are available in a council member's budget, that does enable that council member to submit an item to the city council to contribute surplus funds in a discretionary account for a municipal public purpose, and for a 501c3, a nonprofit entity that provides a municipal public purpose to the Berkeley community. There was a question around one of the budget council referrals, I think by former Councilmember Davila, to look at creating a community fridges program. This is something that we did refer to the budget process, although I'll note that we had many questions around the safety and the feasibility of implementing that particular proposal. And so that's one of many referrals that members of the city council have made to our budget process. I think there's about over $10 million in requests that have been referred to our budget process. And so it is now the job of the city council to evaluate all those different proposals and to prioritize and to decide based on whatever available revenues there are to decide, what we should prioritize and fund this budget process, and what we should maybe defer to a future budget process. So that's just one of many budget referrals that the city council will be considering. Another question is, this question is, currently none of the future revenue nor expenses are reflected in the budget, even though the city of Berkeley is expecting to receive $66 million plus. Will you be exploring and changing the cash basis to an accrual basis accounting that is even more transparent to everyone? And I will defer to the finance experts to be able to answer that question. So I don't know, Mr. Murty or Mr. White, if you have any insights to share on that.
Want me to jump in, Roman?
Yeah, I'll think about.
Sure. So, this is actually there's been a lot of conversation about this, particularly at the Budget and Finance Committee over the past year. And, we've looked at the options and the pluses and minuses around switching from cash to a modified accrual. And there certainly are pluses and minuses to both. Right now, I would say there isn't a strong drive or desire to switch from our current practices. They represent a very accurate portrayal of the resources we anticipate receiving and do receive. But certainly we are open to naturally taking any direction from the Budget and Finance Committee and Council about continuing to engage in that evaluation and discussion.
Mr. Mayor, I do just want to add, and I want it to be very specific. So in the budget book, we do talk about the rescue dollars on page 17 and 18 and 19 of the budget book is where folks can find information about the revenue recovery dollars from the federal government. So information is in there. Now, it doesn't mean that it's laid out on how we're going to spend, but it does go into some details about what we can do with those funds, how we should approach the funds, and what they cannot be used for. So we did address that. And that was early on when we were preparing this budget book. Before we had the detailed guidance, we've tried to update as quickly as we received guidance, even prior to sorting through the guidance that was provided by the federal government. So thank you. I just wanted to add those comments.
Yeah, and I'll just add on the American Rescue Plan that, since the beginning of the pandemic, we were advocating for direct aid to counties and local governments because of the significant revenue losses that we experienced due to COVID-19. As noted last year, we had a $40 million budget deficit. We balanced that deficit through a mix of deferrals, expenditure reductions, and also using our reserves. And that was very difficult, but it got us through a very difficult budget cycle. And now, as we're seeing our economy improve, we hope that those revenues will start to pick up. But this American Rescue Plan funding is so critical. And I'll on my soapbox, thank President Biden and the Congress for providing this critical funding to help local governments get through this very difficult time, to provide continue to provide essential services, to support our essential workers, and to support our COVID-19 response, and to rebuild our economy. And so, as noted, we have received around $66 million in funding. And that will be divvied up, as Mr. White had noted, in over 2 years. And so, our city manager has presented a plan for how to use those dollars for revenue replenishment and supporting a COVID response and other emerging needs. And we are actively working with our city manager and staff on developing that plan and how to spend these dollars. But if it wasn't for the federal government, we would be seeing a much more dire fiscal picture. There's no question about it. Okay, moving on to the next question around pools. This resident is asking around whether the city intends to rebuild Willard Pool, noting that our Southside community does not have a pool. They would really like to ensure that there is a neighborhood pool to serve the Berkeley community, which is particularly important with warmer days happening every year. And they would like to see the city make this a budget priority. And, we have been actively engaged in discussions with Berkeley Unified School District around not just the Willard Pool site, but also all the pools. In fact, all the pools are actually on Berkeley Unified School District property. We don't actually own the property. And these pools were built decades ago in partnership with the school district. And so any decision around the future of the Willard site or on King or West Campus has to be done in cooperation with the school district. And so we recently did enter into an agreement, long-term agreement with the school district around the management of these sites. And discussions continue with the school district around the future of Willard Pool. Whether it's at Willard or whether it's at San Pablo Park or whether it's at West Campus, we're committed to making sure that South and West Berkeley has access to a municipal pool, not just for health, but for recreation. But I want to just turn over to the city manager or deputy city manager. Is there anything else you'd like to add on this point?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Nothing else that I'd like to add at this time. I do think you hit it perfectly. So we can probably entertain the next question. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there are a couple of questions around roads. Can the city prioritize doing major street repairs before the conditions of our streets put us in jeopardy? And I think this gets to a much bigger issue, which is the longer we wait to fix our streets, the more it's going to cost us. Despite bond measure, two bond measures that were passed in 2012 and 2018, we still need more resources to keep up with the condition of our streets and to improve our streets in the city of Berkeley. I think it's been estimated around we need about $300 million roughly to move all of our streets to a pavement condition of 75, which is really kind of average or fair. And so this gets to something we talked about earlier, which is, while we do provide funding on an annualized basis to the general fund and grants and the special funds, we do need a pretty significant infusion of dollars now to be able to keep up with that deterioration, or else it's going to cost us a lot more in the long run. And I'd like to turn over to the city manager if anything you'd like to add on this much broader issue around sort of the condition of our infrastructure and streets.
So yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. We certainly have to do better as an organization, but that takes, of course, funding. And there's been a lot of work to address what our high level needs are, how we can leverage dollars that we have, how we can attract grant funds into our coffers to address some of the needs. But those are small numbers. What we're talking about are millions and millions of dollars that we need to really, truly address change. And I think we also have to look at how we fund our different programs. So right now we're jumping from our Cheerios to different types of streets. We've got to address all of them at some point within a 2 to 4 year time frame, and then come back and apply a maintenance program for them so that we have consistent follow-up and maintenance on a routine schedule. But you can't do that without funding. So it's while we're putting Band-Aids across the city, trying to address doing what we can do with what we have, if we really want to make and affect change in this arena, we will need a large amount of revenue to actually make a true impact, to where not only do some of our streets get served, but all of our streets get served over a short period of time with a maintenance plan to support it. I think one of the things that I'm really excited about is that the council is looking at the equity pieces around our roads. And I know that's something that we'll have to navigate through and figure out how we apply equity across the city, so that all of our communities feel heard and that they feel as if their roads are being repaired and that they can get out there and bike and walk safely. So on a broader scale, I think it affects so much in our city. It affects everything from our risk vulnerability all the way to how we enjoy living and working in Berkeley. And I want it to be that kind of a safe environment for our community. So this is something that's very dear to all of us, and we definitely want to make change in this arena, and we can do better.
Thank you so very much. Okay. There was a question / comment stating that low and very low income families have been most affected by this pandemic, yet the budget slashes funding to our most vulnerable community members. Why are over 3 million in homeless services being cut, 250,000 to youth programs, and 43,000 to child care programs? I guess I respectfully disagree with that assessment. I'm not aware of what homeless services are being cut. In fact, we're looking at expanding homeless services. We are working to maintain the essential safety net. There were 2 programs that the council did provide supplemental funding for: the Healthy Black Family STEP program and Berkeley Place, which is a disability program. And it's my intention to recommend to the city council that we continue that additional funding. It's frankly around under $60,000. It's not a significant, it's not a huge amount of our budget. But other than that, I'm not aware of any homeless services or other social services being cut. We think it's really critical that we maintain our safety net during this critical time, that we look at funding things like emergency rental assistance. So families that have been impacted by the COVID pandemic, that they can pay their rent and they don't face homelessness, to address the needs of our homeless, and to provide critical health and social services. But Madam City Manager, if there's anything else you'd like to add on that.
No, I just think that some of the decision making around our community agencies and services are done through, and especially our Measure P dollars that totally go to fund a number of our homeless services. That is a conversation that perhaps the person calling in or writing in with this particular question may be referring to the panel of experts in terms of their first draft of recommendations to the council. So I'm not sure where this is actually originating, but certainly I have not proposed any cuts, and I have not heard that the council has proposed or recommended to me to make any cuts in this area. In fact, like as you stated, Mr. Mayor, we are increasing our contributions and allocations for homeless services.
Thank you so much. Okay. I do want to address a few questions. One is around why is the mayor's salary so modest compared to other positions in the city organization? Thank you to the voters of Berkeley for passing Measure JJ, which provided an adjustment to the salaries of mayor and council to reflect the growing cost of living in Berkeley and to reflect the increasing responsibilities and work of our city council to serve our community in partnership with our city manager and city staff. There were a couple of questions on the specialized care unit. I think we did touch upon this earlier on. This is still in development. Our city staff is working with our mental health commission and reimagining public safety task force. But I think it's our intention to provide funding in this June budget for a specialized care unit. And there are a variety of different approaches to how we can structure a specialized care unit. And so we're looking at all those things. We're looking at what the potential costs are, how we can implement this. But, I just want to say that, while we are, looking at creating an SCU, I want to make sure that we fill the gap in mental health crisis response in Berkeley. We are seeing a crisis on our streets, increasing numbers of people who are in distress and who need treatment and need help. And so the Budget and Finance Committee, which I chair, including our Vice Mayor Lori Drosty and Kate Harrison, had requested the city manager look at ways that we can expand funding now for expanding our mental health crisis response while we're creating a specialized care unit, whether that's in expanding the hours of the mobile crisis team or working with a nonprofit provider, and how we can expand bike patrols so police can get out in our community and particularly in areas where we've seen crime trends. And so, I do want to separate the mental health issue from the issue of crime and violence and public safety. And we need the right responses for the right types of situations. And so clearly there's a need and we need to expand those resources now. And I just want to thank the city manager for exploring how we can expand our policing and mental health response right now while we're looking at creating the specialized care unit. But my intention, and I want to thank the city manager for working with me on this, and our staff, is to provide funding this June budget for a specialized care unit. It's going to take some time to get that care unit off the ground. And so what do we do in the interim is really the question. And that's the conversation that we're having. There were a number of questions around policing and let me see. Obviously a question is why is the police department budget being increased when when there are some community groups that support a decrease, and the reimagining public safety process is underway. And then I'll just fold into that question as well. In the police budget, there is $6.7 million deferred to, quote, allow space for the reimagining public safety process. Where are these funds accounted for in the budget? And is this money being put into a reserve fund?
So thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I want to talk a little bit about that because I want to make sure that we're really clear on what we're doing. So we are in a shortfall. We have a deficit. And we're using some of the AARP dollars to actually reduce our deficit. But the actual allocations, the positions that are deferred in the police budget are part of our budget alignment. So we're using them to close the deficit. So why is that important? Well, for now, it's what's important. But as we get ready to look at reimagining police and how we align our services, those will still be positions that we actually have, and we'll get to decide how do you want our services to look. The community will be weighing in on that, and council will be providing guidance and direction from a policy perspective on where and how we move forward with the reimagining process. So having positions vacant allows that flexibility. We are using the dollars during the closure of this budget, but it still allows for the flexibility as we move out of this budget, out of this budget year, and start looking at a path forward. Now, where you may see a change in that number is with the new request from the Budget and Finance Policy Committee to me requesting me to come back with a plan or proposal to do some short-term emergency support for both high crime issues in the city, and then separately to look at mental health crises that are happening on our streets. So while we aren't using police dollars for the mental health side of the house, or at least that's not my recommendation, it certainly could be something that council decides, but those police dollars will likely be changed to reflect an immediate temporary need with probably bike patrol or some type of program to address the high crimes that we're seeing in the city. So we are still adjusting this budget. And I just want to be clear that we're moving through a look and find and share and observe it. So it is a dance, and we're trying to kind of get to the final part of that dance so that we can align and have and end with a budget. But moving forward, the positions will not be filled, because what I don't want to do is to be in a position to have to lay off people or lay off employees in order to transition to where our reimagining process lands in the next 6 months to a year. So thank you for that time.
Thank you so much. So, as noted, the positions are currently deferred while we are discussing, the kinds of changes we're going to make to our model of policing and public safety in Berkeley. There's a lot of great ideas that have come from the community, and many of these are being, discussed at the Public Safety Reimagining Task Force. We want to look at how we launch an SCU. We want to look at, how we can create a new model around traffic enforcement. That work is underway, and we're also looking at, the implementation of the BERC referral. So. And then also how we can invest in programs that address, some of the social determinants, such as violence prevention and intervention, expanding homeless services and mental health response, so that we can, promote a more holistic approach to public safety and public health in our community, and ensure that we can free up limited police staffing and resources for those calls that require those types of responses. So that work is underway. We're having these discussions, the budget committee. We welcome specific recommendations and input, not only through the survey, but through our budget process. And, whether we're going to look at what things we could do in June, and there's going to be a much bigger conversation this November after the task force and the community process completes its work. So thank you. Let me see. Yes.
Mayor, as you look at the next question, I do want to say that keeping the positions vacant in the police department has a tremendous impact. I don't want it to seem as if we've made that decision and there are no impacts. We certainly have recognized that, and as a result, I'm going back to take a look at what we can do to address the crime, the pockets of crime that we're seeing across the city. So when we reduce positions, when you're with the department that we never got up to 181 funded positions, we never got to that number. So we were always trying to reach a number, but through retention and or folks retiring through the city, we see a decrease, and it's a continuous up and down in terms of staffing. So we're always having to kind of navigate and meander our way through to make sure we don't drop too far below our staffing levels, so that we can address some of the policing issues, some of the crime issues that are happening across the city. So anyway, I just wanted to just make sure that I state that it is and it will cause impact to our city service delivery until we readjust our model of service in terms of delivery of those police services.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that you're really addressing, which is, we do need to continue to provide baseline services. I have, my position is, and it will remain that, and this is my expressing an opinion, is that, unfortunately, the prevalence of guns, having a trained police force is necessary to protect public safety. It's a question of how many police officers do we have, and what are their functions, and how we can support them, and how we can really advance a community policing framework. I've gotten a lot of very thoughtful input from the Berkeley community this past year around the issue of public safety. Some people think we should abolish the police. Some people think we should significantly reduce the size of the force. And some want us to have a police department that is from the Berkeley community, really prioritizing local residents working on our force and having police officers out there walking the beats and building relationships with the community and with our merchants. And so we have to recognize that public safety means many things to many people. And we have to really, and that's the whole point of this conversation that we launched last year, to move towards a new paradigm of public safety that is anti-racist and that's focused on addressing the public safety needs of everyone in our community. And I think by investing in these alternative models, it will free up our limited police resources to more effectively serve our community and make sure that we are not having people caught up in the criminal justice system, that people that need mental health treatment are getting the treatment that they need and the right response, that our homeless are getting the services and housing supports that they need to address their needs. And so that's the overall framework. But we have to recognize that we need to continue to provide services to our community and provide public safety resources for our community while we're having this much bigger conversation around reimagining public safety. So I thank you, City Manager, for addressing that. I think it's really important to emphasize that. Okay. There's a question on unfunded liabilities, and this is one of our second to last questions. So question is, given the $2 billion identified in the unfunded liability report on March 16, 2021, what is the city's plan? Is there a plan to borrow that entire amount? How is the city proposing to manage our unfunded liabilities? So I don't know if Mr. White or Mr. Murchie, if you have any thoughts to share on that. I know that we talked about the Section 115 trust. And I don't know if you could touch on some of the strategies we're working on around addressing what is a growing number. There's no doubt about that. And it's important to note that we don't have to write a check tomorrow for the full, 500 million, but we do have to set aside money through contributions from the city and from our employee groups and through things like having a reserve. So that when we do have to make those payments, we will make those payments because it is a commitment we have to make to our employees. And we have to look at ways that we can manage those expenditures through working with our labor groups so that we are not having to compromise our delivery of city services while we are meeting our needs to support our workers. But Mr. White, you can talk a little bit about what are we doing around unfunded liabilities?
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. There's a number of things that we are doing, as you mentioned. So we are actively monitoring our pension liability, and we have developed the Section 115 trust, as we've talked about. We are, quote unquote, pre-funding our payments so that we save money on interest, which means that we pay that pension contribution on an annual basis upfront and save the money on interest instead of paying it over the course of a year. But the biggest thing that we are doing right now is setting up that 115 trust to allow us to set aside some resources to pay for additional contributions over time. Other liabilities that we're dealing with and manage, we have reserves set up for our workers' compensation. So for employees that are injured on the job, they obviously are entitled to medical care. And so we are saving those resources to make sure that we can honor those obligations. When it comes to infrastructure, there's a number of things we're looking at. We have a very active maintenance budget, but one of the things that we worked very closely with the City Council on was bringing forward Measure T1, which is allowing us to reinvest in a number of our critical infrastructure projects. And as we move forward with that, we are turning our attention to Vision 2050 and spending a lot of time thinking about how we can be very proactive in bringing forward the needs of our infrastructure on a daily basis, but also thinking about how we can integrate a number of different important concepts to ensure that we're doing it in a green and sustainable fashion. So we're looking to the future and are very much looking to develop plans and recommendations for council that will allow us to generate the resources necessary to continue to reinvest in our infrastructure unfunded liabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Last question I want to turn to our panel is the status of the YouthWorks program. Are we fully funding, and will we be reopening the YouthWorks program? Knowing this is a really critical skill development program for our young people. I think even during the pandemic, we had a limited program last year. And I believe the city manager's baseline budget does include funding, full funding, so that the wages can match the minimum wage requirements. But are we going to be launching YouthWorks this summer?
So yes, and it's living wage. Really,
Living wage, correct? Yeah.
Thank you. Rama can certainly speak to the dollar amount, but you know, with the pandemic, we didn't have the business support to actually host our young people to do some of these programs that we have across the city. But we do plan to relaunch our youth programs. Rama, do you want to speak to the dollars? I don't know if you have that available.
Yeah, I think we built into our baseline almost $400,000 towards the living wage YouthWorks program. So that is part of our baseline budget, and you know, it is trying to be in accordance with the regulations. So it is like part of the budget.
Great, thank you so very much. So those were all the questions that we had received, and I want to thank the many Berkeley residents who sent in your questions and for your interest in the budget process. I hope this town hall provided a background around our budget process, around the proposed city budget, around some of the particular policy issues around the budget, what we're contemplating, and particularly the opportunities to get involved. And before we close, I just want to share a slide that talks about some of the upcoming budget discussions. Give me 1 second. Okay, so this Thursday, June 10th at 10 o'clock, the city's Budget and Finance Policy Committee will be meeting to further continue our discussions on the city budget. I will acknowledge that there may be a special meeting on Monday of the Budget and Finance Policy Committee, so stay tuned for that. We encourage you to go to the city's website to access all of the agendas for the Budget Committee, all the supporting documents, the presentations, the budget reports, and the videos of the meeting. And I want to thank our staff for recording and posting the videos of all the budget committee meetings, including the presentations from our city departments on their proposed budgets. June 15th, next Tuesday at 6 o'clock, the City Council will have a discussion on recommendations on the city's budget. June 24th, we have another scheduled meeting of the Budget and Finance Policy Committee. My expectation is at that meeting, I will present my proposed budget recommendations to the committee, and the committee will hopefully discuss and make a recommendation to the City Council in time for our vote on Tuesday, June 29th, in which we must adopt our budget before the end of the fiscal year. We will not only be adopting a new budget for fiscal year 2022, but also an annual appropriations ordinance to implement the budget that we adopt. So, this is one of many opportunities for input. And I really want to encourage the Berkeley community to participate in these meetings, to talk about your priorities, to ask questions. We welcome your written feedback to council@cityofberkeley.info and your specific recommendations. And we are committed to crafting a budget that really reflects our community's values and our community's priorities. I also want to once again encourage members of the public, because the issue around reimagining public safety has been a focus of our city government and something that has been of great interest to the community, to once again encourage the community to fill out the community survey on public safety. That survey will be open until June 15th, next Tuesday. We highly encourage everyone to fill out the survey. You can find the survey online once again at the city's homepage at www.cityofberkeley.info. So with that, I want to just thank our city manager, our deputy city manager, our budget manager for participating in tonight's town hall. Thank you for your questions. And we look forward to working with the Berkeley community to adopt a budget to guide our goals and priorities for this next fiscal year. So thank you for tuning in, and have a great evening.